Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our pre-debate interviews. We're bringing you each of the debaters appearing on the stage of Roy Thomson Hall tonight here in downtown Toronto to debate the global refugee crisis. I'm very pleased to welcome to Toronto, just off a plane from the United Kingdom, Nigel Farage. He's a member of the European Parliament. He's also the leader of UKIP, the UK Independence Party that won almost 4 million votes in the most recent British national elections. Nigel, great to have you here in Toronto. You're an important voice in this debate, and we want to hear a bit of that voice right now. You've looked at this debate through the lens very much of security and the extent to which you have an analysis, a feeling here that the wave of migration that we're seeing out of the Middle East into Europe and some potentially through to the United Kingdom represents a security threat. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I mean, sure, but can I just sort of start at very, very basics?
Yes.
You know, we've got this debate tonight, and you've entitled it The Global Refugee Crisis. And I think what we need to do is actually to begin by asking ourselves, what is a refugee? Mm-hmm. Now, my family, and you can hear my sort of slightly French-sounding name that I've got, my family were French Protestants who were being burnt at the stake and having terrible things done to them, and came to Britain back in the 1700s. They were refugees. We took people in Britain from Russia, Jews who were suffering very badly. We took Jewish people from Germany, from Austria. We took Ugandan Asians when Idi Amin went absolutely mad and threatened to kill them all. You know, no country knows more about what a refugee is and to act responsibly than the United Kingdom. But a refugee is somebody who directly fears persecution because of their race, their religion, their orientation, or political views, all right? What we've had, really starting last April, May, coming across the Mediterranean into the Greek islands and a bit into Italy, are people, hardly any of whom qualify as refugees. This is a vast migratory wave, and the big mistake, you know, I want to argue tonight that I do believe those of us in the West should have compassion in our hearts and should be able to offer refugee status to people who are genuinely in fear of their lives because of who they are. But the European Union have completely redefined what a refugee is, and they've said that if you have been displaced by war, you qualify as a refugee. And even more stupidly, they've said if you come from a poor country, you qualify as a refugee. So by my calculations, that means about 3 billion people potentially could come into the EU. Now, so we've had an open door, and 1 million people settled in just Germany alone last year. We have not been able to security check a single one of them. And here's the real problem, and here's why I'm majoring on security. You know, I remember as a little boy watching the BBC News and seeing Asian families on the tarmac at Heathrow, humble, grateful, saying, thank you, Great Britain, thank you for giving us refuge here. Amin was going to kill us. We're going to work hard, we're going to integrate, we're going to become part of your community and your society. And by goodness me, they've been the most successful migrant wave ever to come to the United Kingdom. What we now have are predominantly young, aggressive males who, when they cross the border into an EU country, punch the air and chant like football supporters. And these are economic migrants, and not one of them has been security checked.
But you would concede that Europe has severe demographic problems, that they in fact need younger, vital males to ensure that there are professions filled, that their economies continue now into the future. And as you point out, the previous waves of immigration were reasonably successful. Europe has not had a history of failed immigration.
But then there's a difference. Firstly, in numbers. Okay. You know, when those Ugandan Asians came to Britain, 28,000 came. Mm-hmm. You know, legal migration into Britain last year was 600,000. Mm-hmm. You know, so we're looking at different numbers and a different scale to anything before. But here's the problem. Here's the real problem. when ISIS say that they will use, and I'm going to call it the migrant crisis, because that's actually what it is, when they say they will use the migrant crisis to flood Europe with their jihadist fighters, I've been saying for over a year, perhaps we should listen to them. We now have the boss of Europol, the EU's own police force, who 3 weeks ago said he now believes there are 5,000 jihadi fighters who've been engaged in the war in Syria, who've crept back into Europe posing as migrants. We have a real security issue.
You also have long-standing allies in Europe who, unlike the United Kingdom or Canada, are not separated by a body of water and therefore not separated by any obstacle to this wave of migration. What do you owe? What does Canada? What does the United States? What does the United Kingdom owe its European allies in this crisis?
Well, you're right that the borders in much of Europe tend to be slightly vaguer than they are. We're an island; it makes life easy. But of course, what the EU's done is to introduce this thing called Schengen. And Schengen means you can travel freely around Europe. And of course, the idea was fine and dandy, wonderful. It lets nice people travel freely around Europe. The problem is it lets bad people travel too. And there is a big rethink going on, not amongst politicians, but amongst voters. That Paris massacre last November, the Kalashnikov rifles that were used to kill 130 people traveled in the boot of a car from Berlin. They crossed into the Dutch border, they crossed through into the Belgian border, they crossed into France without at any stage anybody stopping, asking for a passport or doing a check. And I would say to you that given the Alliance for Deutschland, this very new party which is surrounded by scare stories, given that it got 25% of the vote the other day in an East German province, there is a big rethink even on that. What do we owe our allies? What do we owe our friends? The things that we've always owed them: solidarity, friendship, and good advice. And good advice is to say to Europe and other countries around the world that when Australia faced a similar problem, not as big, I'll grant you, but when Australia faced this problem of large numbers of people coming by sea to Australia to claim refugee status, and we saw boats sinking, people, all the same things we've seen in the Mediterranean, the Australians said, no. Anyone that comes by this route will not be given refugee status. If you want to apply to come to Australia as a refugee, we will process you offshore. That is what the Australians have done, and I would suggest to you that is what the European Union now needs to do.
And do you think this agreement with Turkey is a movement in that direction, and therefore do you welcome it?
Do you know something? The British Prime Minister has just had a renegotiation with the European Union ahead of a referendum that we're going to have on our continued membership on June 23rd. I wish the Turks had negotiated for us, because what's happened is we've agreed to give them 6 billion euros. We've agreed that we'll send some people back who aren't genuine refugees. In exchange, they will send us people that they deem to be refugees. We will have visa-free access for 77 million Turks by July, and we're going to fast-track Turkish membership of the European Union. Overall, in terms of migratory waves, the deal with Turkey has made things a lot worse.
And then just finally, this is a complicated crisis, a crisis that in many ways has its origins in what's happening in the Middle East, which is the creation of a series of failed states that is now stretching its way across the Middle East. So how do you see this coming to an end? Is there a responsibility, first and foremost, to sort out the crisis in Syria?
Well, I'm sorry, but we've caused much of the crisis.
Indeed, some would argue that.
I have been
in Iraq also.
I have been consistently, for 15 years and more, saying, stop meddling with Arab nationalist regimes. We may not like the men that run those countries, but they are at least secular. And that went for Gaddafi. It very much went for Saddam Hussein. I'm not praising these people, but I'm pointing out they were running secular states. So yes, we do bear some responsibility for what has happened. But I'm going to make one plea. There's one group of people being completely ignored in all of this, and they're called Christians. And the Christians are being massacred in Iraq and in Syria. Their numbers are about 1/10 now of what they were 20 years ago. And you know, despite this massive migrant crisis, no politician in Europe has said, let's give refugee status to the Christians who've got nowhere else to go. We're not thinking right. We're not understanding the history of how to deal with refugees. I'm not cold-hearted. I'm not turning my back on people in genuine need. I'm just suggesting that in terms of the global crisis, the European Union is the absolute worst example of how to deal with it.
Well, Nigel Farage, we look forward to hearing more of this tonight on the stage of Roy Thomson Hall. 3,000 people have turned out to hear this debate. It'll be broadcast across North America on CPAC here in Canada and C-SPAN throughout the United States. That's live at 7 p.m. Eastern on those networks. We'll be back again in a matter of moments with our final two remaining debaters. Stay tuned for those interviews.